Welcome to the latest episode of the Stay Informed podcast. We're your hosts of Stay Informed. I'm Tom.
And I'm Jessica. Today we're going to be talking about fraud, a super hot topic, and a really serious topic in principle. So I kind of want to do something different, Tom, if you don't mind. I wanted to ask you a joke.
I'm all in. I'm all in.
All right, so I can't take credit for this joke. It was actually told to me, but I thought it was super funny. Why couldn't the frog find his car?
Why couldn't the frog find his car?
He got towed.
Oh my God.
Okay.
Boy, wow. I'm using that with my teens tonight, and I'll be kicked out of the house. Okay, let's go.
Yeah, I have one more, but I'll save it for another day. But that one gave me the giggles.
Oh wow. There you go. Well, I'm not speechless, but I'm close. Wanted to just sort of bring into this issue of fraud and where AI is going and how AI can help with it. We, at Informed, see thousands upon thousands of documents, and we know that our clients in the back end have to review these documents and find fraud. How can we help, and how are some of these documents changing?
Yeah, so I think one aspect of fraud is that it's everybody's responsibility, right? I think a lot of times people think that fraud, and especially auto, doesn't have anybody have really negative effects, right? It's kind of one of those things like, oh, I took a car, they have tons of cars, and it's from a financial services organization, they make their money otherwise. And it's really thought of as kind of a, credit washing or a victimless crime. But in reality, that if we are not all doing our part to really ensure that fraud is, reviewed and adjusted and, identified, then we're really making the industry as a whole have higher interest rates, have more issues, more regulatory compliance components of it, and ultimately just hurting our neighbors, right? So I think that we all want to be good stewards in that aspect. And really, we have to report fraud. It takes a lot of effort to report fraud from a dealer's perspective, from a lender's perspective. We don't want to be doing it. There's potential that if you report something and that is not correct, a false positive, it could hurt a customer. So it's something that we take very serious, like I said, and something that we want to make sure that is really critical to changing the narration of fraud for the entire industry and for our community. What do you think about that, Tom?
One thing I completely agree. And, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as victimless fraud because, as you pointed out, it causes an increase in prices. It makes the customer experience maybe more frictionful because people are trying to put in fraud checks. I mean, one question I have for you, Jessica, is we are in a remote environment in terms of how a lot of documents are shared with lenders. How do lenders right now evaluate documents and protect themselves without giving away the secret sauce, mind you? But what are some of the risks and challenges we have? We're in an era of generative AI where people can create fake documents. How can technologies like what we have help?
Yeah. So, the fraudsters are ever changing. They're very dynamic. And once you kind of catch up to one, there's another fraud trend that you have to really be a parent of. So I think that one fraud consortium, making sure that we are sharing information, making sure that we're going to the latest fraud conferences, learning from each other in a financial services industry is really critical. There's so many different types of fraud. We could have a whole podcast on all the different types of frauds and how everyone defines them differently. But ultimately, I think just learning about fraud from the people that are front and center and reviewing these fraudulent cases and understanding them is really critical because these fraud trends change so much. And in that aspect, AI can really be beneficial, that we can have a hunch that we think maybe this data has this idea and maybe it's going this way. And then going down and sitting side by side with the fraud teams and saying, hey, is this something that you're really seeing on there within your day-to-day and experience? I think that's really the best way to make sure that we're getting all of the abilities to combat fraud from a AI perspective, is understanding what the humans are doing to combat fraud, because ultimately that's who we're combating from a fraudster perspective.
You raised some incredible points there, Jessica. The two I'd like to point out are, one, the idea of the consortium, and two, the idea that there's people in the back end who are working these fraud problems. So as I understand it, with Informed, we hear about fraud trends from our individual clients, and they tell us what's happening. And then we have the ability to automate or check for some of these latest developments. So on the one hand, say company X finds fraud, they tell us how to find it, we build into our systems, and then company Y also benefits from this new technology. Maybe you can talk about some of the things that we've learned from individual clients that we now have systematized.
Yeah, definitely. So we hear, that fraud is an issue across all of our lenders. We benchmark fraud from the perspective of how often we see fraudulent templates. We also look at a holistic approach that looks at different data elements across the industry to ensure that we're getting those, trends that maybe are not seen day to day because it affects so many different types of portfolios, and it's a little bit harder to see across a day to day organization. So we're really consistently making sure that all the feedback in our feedback loop for fraud is taken into consideration. As soon as we get an email, we have an SLA to respond really quickly so that we know that we want to make sure that we take these things serious, because once again, we want to keep a really low false positive rate because we don't want to have any customer harm, meaning we identified somebody that was potentially fraudulent and they ended up not. We have a 0.01% false positive. I'm really proud of that.
Wow.
Like I said, we want to make sure that we're doing right by our community, making sure that the consumer is not harmed, but then we are identifying fraud. So lenders and dealers are not at risk either.
Well, and I was just thinking about that. My understanding is that there are literally tens of thousands of bank documents or banks. And so, how could any individual fraud examiner at a bank understand all those different forms? But if you have a consortium, if you have somebody who has analyzed all those documents, you've sort of empowered that fraud examiner to be that much more effective. I was wondering, is that correct or?
Oh yeah, that's spot on. I feel like I'm a somewhat semi-expert of fraud. I don't want to toot my own horn, but have run several fraud teams and from an operations perspective ran fraud strategy. So I'd like to think that, I know how to avoid going down the rabbit hole of reading Google reviews of dealers and understanding fraud templates. But, and people, when you're suspecting fraud, you start looking at Facebook, you start looking at where do they work, and you start tracking down, is that a real address, and looking at Google Maps and all the things, right? And so it's kind of fun sometimes, but you can definitely waste time and it's a lot of effort and you really miss things. So like I said, I feel semi-expert. And the other day I was going through our enhancement for our fraud model and I was looking at pay stubs, and I knew that this application had 2 fraudulent pay stubs, and I was looking at them and I was like, they look, pretty good. It looks really realistic. And I read it glazed over and it was a Walmart, the other one Walmart. And I was like, okay, so maybe they were doing it. And then when I was looking at the review of why those were identified of it, it was because a number of things, but the biggest indicator was that they had written Walmart as one word, Walmart. And then they had written on the second application 2 different pay stubs, Wal-Mart, and me, semi-expert of fraud, was thinking, oh, these look really great. And but it's just, you start skimming, and I go back to that conversation where they put the item, like the words on a screen, and you can still read it. And it's, when you're looking at all those documents, processing them quickly, even when you know that you're looking for fraud, you can still be biased. You can still be in a hurry and skimming through. And like I said, I was looking at a fraud enhancement model documentation, and I was like, these look fine. So
It's so funny you say that about the expert being tricked. I have a similar experience. I spent a number of years before Informed working on identity theft issues, and I thought I was such an expert. And then I got phished by a message from my father, and it wasn't actually from my father. It was from somebody who, had spoofed him. And so, even the experts now can be tricked, and which raises a question for me to you, which is, I've heard in the security space that AI can now make attacks so much more complicated and they can generate attacks so quickly that the only way to defend against AI is to have AI on your side. And so I was just wondering if maybe you could talk about how, just think about how easy it is now to create a fake form and how you can imagine a generative AI platform creating a fake bank statement by looking at 1,000 bank statements. And then you're a fraud examiner saying, well, maybe that is real or maybe it isn't. How do you think about the threat of generative AI in terms of fraud?
oh yeah, I think that having, multiple attack channels is always a threat for our landscape in cybersecurity and, creating synthetic IDs. I think when we really push towards digital retailing, that we really need to focus on, like you said, not walking into a dealership and what does that consist of. I think documents is really key on being able to validate who you are, and from a KYC perspective, from a consumer perspective, that's really critical. From a lending perspective, we want to make sure those documents are accurate and not fraudulent. And then on top of that, it's really, like you said, those the machines, right? Like we are having people that are machines creating synthetic IDs, within seconds all the time. And so making sure that even from a security perspective, from a technology perspective, on your digital retailing solution, it's there. We have dealer portals that we really support and are powered by Informed. We have to make sure that the security precautions there, from an MPPI perspective and privacy, links, QR codes, SMS. There's so many different items that we really need to consider so that we're really having a holistic approach to fraud.
I mean, it's so interesting. When we think about what AI can do for fraud, I think back in the day where it used to be if you had an SSN or somebody's SSN, you could be well on your way to synthetic identity fraud now. But just think what the capability is now. You can have a fake LinkedIn profile. You can have your generative AI create a fake dossier for you or a fake resume. The sophistication of the responses of the generative AI just means that people have to be that much smarter. And it really shows the power of having technology to react. One thing I'd love to nerd out with you on, among many things, is like how many ways that you can identify a fraudulent pay stub or a fraudulent bank statement. I've seen from some of the examples of our customers issues like the size of the font, where the statement or the data is on the bank statement, the way they write out the name. Any thoughts on, some of the interesting ways that people fake bank statements?
Yeah, so number one, template based. You have the way that documents are lined up. You have bold context. You also have even how your numbers are lining up. Sometimes people even end them all in zeros, thinking that would pass through. Maybe it would if I was reviewing them, but definitely not our AI machine. So tons of different options. And really, from a holistic approach, it's not just on pay stubs. We're doing all the checks and verifications that a funder would do when they stare and compare. And like I said, if you're staring and comparing at fraud, funding documents all day, you're likely to make a mistake. So just having the ability from an AI and creating all of those verifications and checks is really a level up.
One thing that people often don't discuss, but I think it's very important, is the idea of the false positive, the idea that somebody isn't a fraudster and you're caught in a fraud detection check. People get annoyed because, of course, I'm the real me. They're not thinking about all the other fraudsters that have been stopped. So how do we prevent the ordinary consumer? Or how do we assist entities in stopping the bad guys and not bothering the good guys?
Yeah, I mean, if you can imagine, like you said, it is a very complicated process, but we do take it very serious. We are consistently monitoring all of our fraud trends, as well as understanding our false positive rates. Like I said, we have a number of feedback loops from lenders, as well as integrated with several fraudulent conferences and information. We meet monthly with a number of banks that are in a contributory database so that they can give us their insights on what is the latest, greatest fraudster trend. And then understanding from the perspective of AI, I think it's really critical of being able to uncover those fraud patterns that you cannot see on a day-to-day as an individual. So AI is really helping to identify suspicious activities and patterns that is across the industry and the portfolio. So I think it's also, fair to say that having a benchmark across portfolios of different lenders of different types gives the lenders more power to say, hey, there may be an issue. Because a lot of times we hear lenders that are like, I don't know if I have a big fraud problem. I don't know if that's just what I should expect of doing business, right? But we also as an industry are continuing to ensure that we have the best antics to catch fraud.
Jessica, I think it's so exciting as we're working with multiple partners, the collaboration we're seeing with us on stopping fraud. I think people really recognize that to address fraud, the only way we can stop it is by working together. And it's really not a competitive issue, it's an industry issue. And so I think I'm so excited to work with you and others at Informed to actually see if we can collectively put a dent into this problem. It's been such a pleasure talking about fraud. I know we can talk about this for hours. And so I look forward to continuing this conversation, and hopefully we can even bring other experts on from the industry to help discuss and help tackle such an important problem.
Would love it. I can't wait. Thanks so much. And until then, stay informed.
Stay informed.